Presentation on prospect theory, a new interesting idea that might help software testers. My name is Ross Collard, and it'll come to my bio in just a few minutes. So what we're talking about here is risk-based testing. Risk assessment is a tool in the tester's toolkit, and we'll be going over all these points, so I won't go into them in great depth yet. But I'll actually have more words on the overhead than I will speak, sort of reverse usual speakers. I'm assuming that you can read faster than I can speak, so there's background to fill in as we go. Again, I'm going to be talking about risk-based testing and using risk assessment to direct the test effort. There's a possible new breakthrough. I call it possible because it's an interesting idea, but somewhat untried so, as yet. It's called prospect theory. A couple of fellows called Kahneman and Tversky. Actually, I should correct that. One of the fellows, Kahneman, got the Nobel Prize in 2002 for this. His partner would have, but he was deceased, and they don't give the Nobel Prize out to people after they've passed away. So this theory, as you can see on the overhead, is a more enlightened way of understanding risks and probabilities. And we've identified some ways which we'll get into later on about how do people underestimate some kind of probabilities and risks and overestimate others, and we use that to improve our risk assessment. By the way, questions are welcome at any time. Please jump in as you go. Please feel free to jump in as we go and ask questions if you'd like. Are there any statisticians in the group? Good, that's really good. Okay, because nobody will be able to time out with statistical questions. That's good. Okay, intended audiences, we're giving this for experienced software testers, but that's only partly true because a lot of the material is fairly basic. If you haven't heard it before, it's good stuff. It's worth knowing. People like Harry Robinson, Julian Hardy, and so on. And we're also giving this for relatively new testers. Even if you've got 3 to 5 years experience, according to us old salts, you're still pretty new. And there's some good stuff in here too. It's going to be practice rather than theory. Very much oriented towards working practitioners, not to academicians. Some secondary audiences worth a quick mention. I sometimes talk about this and do consulting work for people, hedge fund managers, and other people who have their private jets, that kind of thing. And people like software engineering managers and psychologists and so on, mostly the first two. Myself, I originally put something down here quite stuffy and pompous about my credentials, but I thought this was more interesting. So let's, I said Clooney, I think it's Clooney, isn't it? George, I think I got his name wrong there, Helen Hunt. So I claim to be way cool, although in truth I'm such a nerd I don't recognize half these people walking around. So, but, I put down Cooney, oh well. He's a new guy in town. Yada yada. I've been around, I've worked with quite a few firms, high tech and large, multinational enterprises and so on. I've also taught over the years at places like Harvard and UC Berkeley. In terms of credentials, I went to Caltech and Stanford myself, which means they take any idiot these days. So enough about me. Sorry? Oh, that's somebody walking outside the room talking. So, moving right along. Take to the practice. One thing I'll say up front, and we'll return to this a few times, quantitative methods for risk assessment don't work. They don't work very well anyway. We don't really know how to measure things on some kind of linear or nonlinear scale, not very well. And we also, as well as not being able to get the right numbers in the first place, in terms of measuring things, metrics, we don't really know how to apply arithmetic to them. We don't know whether we should add numbers or multiply them. And so, although there's risk-based quantitative techniques out there, I should say quantitative risk techniques out there, especially in the military and especially in the government agencies in Washington, I think they're a little bit dubious because you can get any answer you want out of them. And even worse than that, if you're consciously trying to manipulate to get the answer you want, that's one thing. But instead, if you are manipulating and unconsciously, you have unrecognized assumptions behind the numbers, then you're going to be in trouble. So quantitative doesn't help. What about the qualitative methods? Well, unfortunately, they tend to be as good as the practitioner. If you're someone who's pretty shrewd and savvy and alert today, you're not, half asleep because you've been sleep deprived by some late night project, then you might do this well. But it's very much individual and so on. So we have a bit of a problem here. Luck has got a lot to do with it. As Napoleon said, and I'm sure this is a misquote, but it's roughly right, just before Waterloo, I understand that Napoleon said, don't give me brilliant generals, don't give me virtuous generals, give me lucky generals. I guess he didn't get enough of them for Waterloo. Moving right along, levels of sophistication of this address. First half is going to be fairly basic. Again, if you haven't heard it, if it's new to you, it's important. And I would call my presentation masterful. Sorry about that hum. And then we'll get into increasingly more intermediate to sophisticated material. If you're really pretty experienced in this area, you can take a 45-minute nap, tune out, go write another test framework or something, 45 minutes, and then we'll get to the more speculative stuff. And I don't have too much at the very end because I don't know too much about the breaking edge. I don't think anybody does. But we'll discuss what's out there. Probabilities, we have to be fairly savvy. We have to be fairly knowledgeable about assessing probabilities. That goes with the territory. We can't really do risk assessment without knowing the chances of things happening. Having said that, an opinion on my part, which is a bit harshly stated here, I'm not talking about Google, I'm talking about the big world in general, the aggregate. People's test skills and probability are fairly pathetic. You see this question on the overhead here. I ask this quite often, well, not too often because I'd be pilloried, but I'd be run out of town. But I ask it at conferences from time to time. And the question you'll see is the following. What's the likelihood that the person sitting next to you has got the same birthday? Now, I typically ask that of people, and they sometimes look like deer caught in the headlights. They're sort of stunned. But I give them 2 or 3 minutes to think about it and scratch away on a piece of paper. And of course, if you think about it, the answer is the following. You have a birthday on a particular day, unless you were not born but hatched, as I was myself. Sorry, that's an old stupid joke. Couldn't resist. You presumably have a birthday. The probability of the person next to you having the same birthday is probably 1 in 365. That may not be true. Let's say you have a convention of people all on the same birthday. You're not going to have that probability, but assuming it's just random, from the population in general, you probably have a probability of 1 in 365. The person next to you is going to be have the same birthday. And if you want to be really nitpicking and precise, it's 1 in 364. 1 in 365 and a quarter, because every 4 years is a leap year, 366 days, average 365.25. So that makes us feel morally superior to get it that precise. That rounds out to about 0.3%. You'll see this number here. This was actually chosen by about 20% of the people. That's typical in these conferences. After they sort of boo me because they feel bad, they then go ahead and vote for this, and that's actually lower to pick the second choice. Only 20% of the people is actually lower than what would be picked by a totally random choice, which is leads us to the term dumb monkey testing. No, that's not true. Dumb monkey testing is something else, invented by a guy called Noel Nyman out of Microsoft. But what I'm saying here, we don't have very good skills, most of us, we don't have very good skills in this area. Now, I don't mean to be superior and pompous. I'm just saying this is the way it is for many, many people in our field. Before I go ahead, instead of leaving us hanging, let me say that this is an opportunity, to improve. Getting some basic training in probability, I think, will help a lot of us, basic training in logic and so on. Enough on that. Let me move ahead. Some basic ideas. These are worth a quick tour, and I think these are all pretty obviously already. A risk. I define a risk as any significant chance of non-trivial loss. Some people disagree with that. They might say any possibility of a loss. But some losses are very, very small, a thousandth of a penny, and the probabilities are very, very small. We're not going to bother with all of them, just the key ones. Am I speaking in from the wrong position?
It's not your problem. The mic is a little too loud. It's a little too hot.
And there's a comment here about chances may be more to do with uncertainty than probability. That's somewhat controversial. A lot of people would pounce on that and disagree. But what I'm saying is we'll never really know the actual probability, or at least the probability distribution or probability envelope, because we'll have one situation, it'll either work or not. So, we're probably more interested in certainty than probability itself. Probability is a sort of slippery concept, in my opinion, which makes it interesting. I've really talked about this already, so just let me move on, unless anybody has questions. A loss, is again a very simple, obvious definition. Loss is anything that we care about. One thing I'll mention up front, and we're going to come back and talk about this in a bit more depth. It seems in some ways obvious when I say it, but it's actually quite profound. A gain is different from a loss. You find that a person has a possibility of losing $5 versus gaining $5, equal probability either way. The two are not sort of transferable back and forward. A gain is psychologically different from a loss, and that's going to be important to us. A risk is just a possibility, as it says here in the middle of the overhead. It's not actually real until it eventuates. Something actually realizes that risk. Turns into an event or a failure. In the meantime, we worry about it. Faults and failures, I couldn't resist putting these in because some of our professional brethren have difficulty with this. It's important to differentiate between the two, depending on which way you use the words, and there's no universal consistency of terminology. People use the words in different ways. What I'm calling the failure here is the actual event, the failure, the problem. That's got an underlying cause, that's the fault. The failure is the problem, the underlying cause is the fault. Back in my early days, about 900 years ago, when I was a young tester, I was naive, and I thought that faults and failures had a one-to-one relationship, or at least some kind of identifiable relationship. They do have relationships, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to fix problems, but relationships are very complicated. What we find is that typically a particular failure can be caused by many different faults, and vice versa. One fault can have many different manifestations of failure in different situations. So it's a complex many-to-many relationship that's often not very well understood. And that tends to complicate the world too. Often we think we're talking about failures, we're really talking about faults in terms of risk assessment, risk identification. Just so long as we have a clear idea on our heads whether we're talking about the symptoms or the causes, it's going to help. Hope I don't sound too preachy. I think if I talk long enough and loud enough, you'll actually know I know what I'm talking about. Excuse me, that was meant to be a funny side comment. But, the term exposure is worth a quick definition too. This is a word that's quite popular in the insurance industry. Risk managers in insurance have a lot to worry about, no pun intended. And they define exposure as being the combination or the multiplication of two factors. One is the probability of an event occurring, and then if it does occur, the cost or consequences of that. Sounds good. You can see this comment at the bottom, however, why is this wrong? Anybody like to tell me what's wrong with that as a definition? It's a good start, but yes, sir.
It screws up extremely high cost and extremely low probability.
Right. Yes, I will. Let me repeat your answer and add a couple more too. Your answer was it screws up at extremely low or high probabilities and extremely low or high costs. It's nonlinear. We know it's nonlinear. To give an example, if you think about it, if this formula is true, none of us would ever buy a lottery ticket, and none of us would ever have fire insurance. Because if you took the cost of fire insurance multiplied by the probability of having a fire, the cost of not having fire insurance, the money you save, I've got to get this right in my brain. You know what I'm trying to say, right? It's really simple. That's why with a big, powerful brain like man, you can't do simple little things. I think it's just the opposite way around, actually. But to be serious here, we have two options. We can either choose to take the fire insurance or not. If we choose to take the fire insurance, we lay out a certain amount of money, and that's gone. On the other hand, if we choose not to take the insurance, if we choose not to pay the fire insurance, we have no outlay now, but we have a probability of a fire, and if a fire does happen, we have our $2 million house, the 2 bedrooms, and 400 square feet in Menlo Park burned down, whatever. So if you multiply out the two options and look at the net benefit either way, it's always best not to take the fire insurance. It's always best not to take the lottery ticket. And this is, of course, the reason why, in aggregate, the insurance firms and the state-run lotteries generally do pretty well. There's another reason for this, too, as well as the fact that we can't multiply things simply together. Again, at the extremes, high probability, low probability, very high, very low, there's non-linearity. The other problem here, of course, is that we actually are assuming by this equation here we can actually measure these things well enough to plug numbers in and actually get a meaningful result. There's so much fuzziness, there's so much unknown fuzz in these numbers that, it's dubious. But it's an interesting concept that I still find useful nevertheless. And again, this is exposure. And the whole idea with risk prioritization is we identify the risks, we do some kind of assessment of the likelihood, assign probabilities to them, we do some kind of assessment of the likely cost if they go wrong, multiply them out to get the exposure for each risk, and then we simply rank them in order from the highest exposure on down. If we've done this correctly, we should have a good risk-based test focus. Check this, check this, check this. These are the most risky things in terms of multiplication of probability by cost. Sounds good, right? Doesn't work very well, but it sounds good. It's better than nothing. Next thing I want to mention in terms of this basic set of ideas is idea of types of risk. As I said here on the overhead, I'll differentiate between a system risk and a project risk. There are many different types of risks. So you see some comments here. Project risks are things that could go wrong in a project. You might have a testing project. Some of the things that could go wrong might include the test tool, automated test tool you choose does not work. Some key server that is going to be part of your test lab does not arrive on time. A key test professional who really knows the heart of the system or the test approach, is out for 3 weeks with flu in February. These are all project risks, but they're not the kind of risks we're interested in here. What we're interested in generally with testing is what I'll call system operational risks. And system operational risk is typically things that go wrong with a system and live operation. We could have this problem, we could have malfeasance, we could have fraud, we could have customers leaving us because we have slow response time, we could have financial losses because of database integrity problems. That's what we're typically talking about here, system operational risks. And again, this is probably obvious to some of you, but if you're not aware of this, it can be fairly difficult to sort out which things we care about, which things we're trying to look at in terms of our risk assessment for testing versus not. There's all kinds of other risks, as it says at the bottom of the page here, marketing risk. Bringing a product out, it might be risk of product development, but it's typically not a risk of marketing. Do they market it right, price it right, advertise it right, publicize it right, that kind of thing. We talked about this already, and I think I mentioned all these points up front. Be very careful with the quantification. It's signs to some people that you're incompetent if you quantify, and it's signs to others that they need to be fairly careful what you tell them. And of course, the problem is, as I said before, that if you don't quantify, you have something possibly even worse, which is just sort of subjective feel, intuitive feel in your risk assessment. I'd like to move on and talk about success for a few minutes. And the reason we're talking about success is you can think about risk in a way as being, the achievement of success or the lack of achievement of success. And the reason I like to look at dimensions of success is because it tends to open up a much richer, broader view of what the risks are. We have a question here, is the system acceptable? It's so broad, it's virtually meaningless. What typically people do when they go through some kind of setting of system acceptance criteria is they go through a checklist of various things and say, this is important, and so on. And some of the kinds of things that might be on the checklist are the things I mentioned here, these dimensions of success. Do the features work correctly? Do we get the right data out of the database? Do we have a full set of features, that kind of thing? That's the first three. I have a list of well over 100 of these features. Well over 100 of these dimensions here of success. That might include things like maintainability, portability, installability, survivability, sustainability, marketability, saleability of the software we're selling, and so on, performance, reliability, robustness, all these kinds of things, many different aspects of success. Maybe 90% of them are not that relevant to us on a particular project. That's good, because then we can just narrow down to what's important. But again, it's useful, I think, to look at these dimensions of success, because it gives us a broader picture of the things. And I'll come back to a few more of these in just a minute. An example, and the whole idea here is we take a particular situation and basically tweak these success factors to say what's really important in this situation. And this one here, for example, I would maintain with this automated or semi-automated help system for the IRS. The types of things I've listed here are most important. Accuracy of the advice given to taxpayers, the usability of the system by the clerical people, the tax clerks using it, the speed, the performance, response time, so on. By contrast, we have a different system. Next example, we have a completely different set of success factors. And again, if you use this approach, you start with a long checklist. I have them if you want to get one. You go through and say, okay, on my project, these things are important in terms of success, and use that definition of success in multiple different dimensions. Use that definition of success as a way of defining risk, risk of failure. I think it's pretty obvious, right? It's important to talk about it because it's easier to say, somewhat harder to do. Some more examples, and we won't go through many of them, but there's another half dozen examples here of what we're talking about from my checklist. Okay, let's come back to risk-based testing. As you can see on the over here, it's a powerful technique. It's limited, as we said more than once already, by the skill of people who do it, subjectivity and so on. But the whole idea is, if we can't test everything, we need to focus the test effort. What we want to do in focusing the test effort is determine which parts of the system, which aspects of the system require the depth and intensity of testing, and which other parts of the system we can afford to skim over or miss testing entirely. The reason we want to skim or lightly test some parts of the system is so we can conserve resources to allocate to the parts of the system that require intense testing. So this is as much a resource allocation question as anything else. How do I decide to allocate the resources I have in testing, which are always limited? It's usually very limited to the different things I could test. That's what risk prioritization and risk-based testing is about. And if it's done well, which often it is, you tend to get a lot of significant problems very early because you're looking at the critical things, you're looking at the important things, getting those big bugs quickly, rather than looking in all the wrong places. Looking at places where the bugs are not likely to be or not likely to be important. We have techniques for identifying test cases. There's various techniques out there. Tools that generate test cases. Harry Robinson of Google is known expert in this area. And we use techniques like so-called path analysis to identify the flow paths through software and generate test cases for it automatically. This is great stuff, but all these test case generation techniques have a problem. They tend to be overwhelming. They give us way more than we can work with. That's the need to sort down based on risk. There's a little bit of redundancy in here. I probably was going to say profound things. If you have any questions, please ask. Otherwise, I'll assume this is also pretty well known to everybody. Risk factors. What we need to do with a risk-based testing approach is typically have some kind of list of risk factors. And we'll go through and say, well, how important is this one, how important that one? Various features or various aspects of the system behavior. And typically the kind of things people have on a list of risk factors will be the following. Number one, customer impact. We might have a feature. This particular feature might have very little customer impact, or user impact. No matter how badly this feature screws up, it can't cost the user community more than 3 cents a year. By contrast, another thing in the same system, if it screws up, might be life critical. Human life is dependent on it. What we're doing is using customer impact and visibility, or user impact and visibility, as a way of assigning criticality. Is this critical? Is it must test? Mission critical? Is it just very minor? That's sort of obvious. Now this is good. This is one way to filter or sort down the different features into the must test. Could test, probably won't test because we'll just take the risk of not testing. This is one sort factor, one sort filter, but it's not enough. So we'll go through a few more to give you the flavor. And again, please jump in if you have questions. Second one, for one of a better name, I've called operational risk. It's often exactly the same thing, but it may not be. This is the risk of something going wrong in operation and the consequences of it. I have an example here that I saw a few years ago. It used to be, this is somewhat aged now, this is probably a good 15 years old. It used to be that the casinos in Las Vegas reimbursed people if the machinery had glitches. This particular example was where a video game machine hiccuped, and although the person won something like $1,000, I think there's a minimum threshold to be reached for the winnings to be displayed on the overhead at all. I think it was $1,000. So somebody won $1,000 and a few pennies. And as you can see for yourself, what happened is the overhead display flashed the maximum possible number the field could hold. Back in those days, the policy of the casinos was generally to pay off. They've changed since then. If you have this happen, they say, sorry, machine, hardware glitch, software glitch, tough luck. It's to us. Again, a fairly obvious point. I have these both down because they might be different views. Sometimes the business operational risk is based on an internal perspective, who the customers are, or who the users are, how they're going to use the system. And it's done by different people on the first one, which is I think we call the, what do we call it again? The customer impact. I got that wrong. I meant to say it the other way around, excuse me. Sometimes this one here is based more on a customer view of the world, so external looking in. This one here sometimes is done, the business operational risk is done by looking internally at the architecture. For example, we might have a system unbeknownst to anybody outside, because to people outside it's a black box system, they don't see the internals. Unbeknownst to anybody outside, we use some kind of database technology we're not very happy with. And so based on our review of the internals, we might say that's an operational risk. The database is going to give us problems, more likely to give us problems than if it had a different approach. So again, sometimes the first one, the customer impact, is done by people outward looking, maybe by people like even market research perhaps, on a big project. This is done by people more like architects and designers, have an internal view. Now these are two factors, but again, that's not enough. There's a success of sorts. I'll mention a third one here. And I'm not going to go through this in great depth, but I have a fair few words on the other things about it. Prior defect history. We have some evidence, and some people vigorously disagree with us. We have evidence against this too. But we have some evidence that if you have some pattern of defects, that's a predictor of what you're likely to have in the future in terms of more defects. Let me just see if I can recall some of the research on this. I do, but I'll get into it as we go. So typically, let's say you have Windows 95 a few years ago. Let's say you were developing different applications and testing different applications, all using the same platform, Windows 95. You might notice a plethora, a commonality of problems of a certain type. You might say, gee, this seems to be common to any application developed under Windows 95. I better look for the new ones. That's just using prior defect history as a way to drive what you're doing. Of course, to do this, you need a prior defect history. If you don't know what the prior defect history was, you can't use it very easily. And two things I want to touch on those lines, worth a mention each. something called defect clustering, and also, what's the other term I have in here? Defect clustering, and the repetition of problems. Let's start with defect clustering. Defects tend to cluster. They don't just occur at random. I did some interesting work as a consultant a few years ago for Apple, and the Apple senior test manager were interested in this following question. Can we basically predict future defects based on the pattern we've seen in the past? They sifted through the data for some time, concluded they couldn't. That's interesting because that's denying what we're saying here, and perhaps they were an exception for good reasons that we don't know. But generally, there is a pattern to defects. I've called it 80-20 here. It may not be 80-20 exactly. Pareto's ratio, it might be 90-10, but you tend to find patterns like this. You can see this example at the bottom from the National Security Agency. As it says here, 13% of all components, 13% of all components contained 90% of the defects, and with the severe defects it was even more skewed, even more marked. That's what we mean by defect clustering. Has anybody been able to apply this in their work? You might have just done it intuitively without thinking about it, but has anybody applied what they've seen as a pattern of bugginess to what they're testing? A few people are nodding. Okay, so it tends to, again, happen intuitively, which is perhaps good. Okay, so defects do cluster. They do have patterns. You know, how well we understand the patterns is another thing, but if we do understand them with some confidence, then we might as well use them to focus our testing. The repetitive nature of defects says that, you know, if something's bitten us once, it or similar bugs are going to bite us again in the future. Something broke once, it's going to break again. Some people disagree with this. They say once it's fixed forever. It really depends, I guess, on the quality of the repair and the propensity. If this particular thing's going to break, other similar things, the same area are going to break too. But it's a little bit like these divorce statistics, which I'll ask you to just browse through here. You might think that once people have the lesson, for most of us, harsh lesson of divorce, I don't think we learn and do better the second time around. But statistically, once people have been divorced once, if they get remarried, they're still optimists. If they get remarried, the likelihood of a second divorce is higher for those people than people who have never married at all. In other words, higher than for the general population. Seems to be some kind of, you know, repetitive pattern there. To make the analogy to software components, if we found one bug in a software component versus others where we found no bugs at all, the probability is higher that that software component will have another bug found in the future. And there's some empirical evidence to support that claim. We're talking about major risk factors, and we're just going through a handful as an example to give you a sense. Another major risk factor for most of us is modifications. We have a lot of evidence that says modifying existing software is a very risky process. This only applies to new versions of existing software, of course, but if you have a look here, you'll see some data from the SEI, Software Engineering Institute. This is part of Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, quite prestigious. Has a lot of government funding, the SEI. And as you can see here, the probability of introducing a defect is high according to these guys. This is not isolated data. IBM did a study on the IBM mainframe operating system. That used to be called MVS, it's now been renamed Z. The IBM mainstream operating system. They did a study saying over the last 30 years, did I get that right? Mainstream, whatever. What was that again?
I thought they were running Linux.
They probably are, actually. No, they're still running this operating system. It's now highly reliable because they've had billions of dollars spent to debug it over 30 years, so it's getting pretty reliable. But to get to the point here, according to their review of their own defect data, 30% of all changes introduce new problems. And Alcatel, the big French telecom giant, has got a similar study. Says about 25% of all changes introduce new problems. To be fair to the software engineers, as it says at the bottom of the page here, most of the defects introduced are trivial, and about 2/3 of them are seen immediately by the authors. You're a software engineer modifying code, you introduce a bug inadvertently, you see it immediately, you fix it. So about 2/3 of these bugs introduced and moved immediately at the unit test phase. We as system testers never see them. But still the remaining 1/3 of the bugs introduced that are not caught by the authors are still quite numerous. So the way we use this risk factor is the following. We look at the system and say, okay, this is a new version. What's been touched, what's been modified, what's been added? And the stuff that's new and modified is probably more risky. The stuff that's already there, existing, hasn't been touched or indirectly influenced by the changes, that's going to be probably more stable. We'll test the existing stuff less, we'll test some, but we'll test less, and we'll test the modifications or the new. sounds good in principle, and it works. It just takes a bit of work to get it to work well. But it does work in principle. Any questions? What I'd like to do is ask you to visualize some kind of table, a worksheet. I could draw up one, but I just realized in sketch pictures in the air and assuming you can visualize this. Have some kind of worksheet, and what we're going to do here is list down the risks. So we'd have to have a series of row names, which would be a list of risks, the risk factors, and then we'd have a series of columns. The first column might say something like probability of occurrence, and the second column might say criticality if it does occur, and then the third column might be the modification or the combination. If it's not modification, combination of the first two. So you might have something like, the risk is, let's say, that customers will not be able to access the system at a peak period of time. That's the risk, and you might say the probability of that is a certain number. The cost of consequence is another number, and then the combination of the two, even if it's not modification, some kind of combination of the two might say together this is either critical or important or nice or irrelevant testing. We'd use that we'd use this worksheet to list everything, then we'd sort it in the order of criticality of the exposure. Now, the reason I mention that here is because you see the second point here, the very questions we're asking are variable. It seems sort of obvious when you think about it, but it's quite profound in a way. We don't really have one generic checklist that will work for all situations. We typically have to take the checklist, the risk assessment checklist, and change the row titles based on the situation. And this might sound a little bit abstract, but let me give you an example of what I mean. A couple of examples. These are other risk factors to just go with these ones here. Other things that might have an effect on testing and complexity. You've got a very simple feature versus a very complex feature, and that might be a subjective evaluation of simple versus complex features. Other things being equal, the complex ones will probably need more testing. Mainstream versus exception, just briefly. Mainstream is something you do all the time. Exception is what the name says. Imagine you have a feature that's been used on average once every 3 years. You have another feature which is similar by any other measure, but while the first feature was being used on average once every 3 years, the second one has been used 800,000 times a day. You probably would test the second one, the mainstream, more heavily used one, based on popularity. So again, these are just a few things to catch up with the list of risk factors we had before. This over here is slightly out of sequence, but that's not a big problem. So we're talking about this idea that the risk factors vary. Coming back to that idea that the titles, the row titles on your spreadsheet change. Let me give you one example here. So far we've talked about systems testing in general, and that's where we had a list of risk factors. We said things like customer impact, business operational risk, prior defect history. That's all good stuff. Now we have some stuff that's specific to performance testing. If you're doing a performance test, you probably want to focus your effort based on these things, as well as the things we had before. But you've got new factors to consider, like, for example, is this a resource hog? Is it resource intensive? Let's say you've got an existing system, you're modifying it. One thing you modify might be a simple little query. Another thing you modify might be some kind of very complex mapping, that generates high resolution maps and pumps them through high bandwidth around the world. Anything that's resource intensive like that, or popular or time critical, is probably going to need more effort. So these are just new risk factors, new things, new rows titles to consider in our matrix on our worksheet. Does that make sense? And these are these things that ring true to you? Are these the kind of things you might look at if you're trying to test the system performance rather than its functional correctness? In terms of prioritize, you give more time to the stuff that was time critical and time sensitive and stuff that was not time dependent at all. You give more time to stuff that's frequently used, which is similar to what we said a moment ago about mainstream versus exception. Things that are resource hogs, things that might, be associated with bottlenecks or might trigger bottlenecks. You focus your testing that way. I hope this is just good old common sense. To give a third example, so far we've gone through the example where we had the generic first situation. We said things like customer impact, business operational risk. If it's different from customer impact, prior defect history, what's new and modified. That was the first one. Then the second one is here. Things like popularity, frequency of use, resource consumption, time and criticality, likelihood of triggering bottlenecks. A third example here is this one here. This is actually from Dell. I did a fair bit of work building risk models for Dell for new product development. And some of the things they have on their lists were things you never see on software lists. One is second source availability. If you're building software, this has no meaning. Although in software you might have things like nasty third-party unknowns, plugins. But second source availability means, a risk factor if you're building a product is your primary source of the component. I had a dinner last night, in fact, with a friend who's CEO and founder of an electronics company in this area. He's got a part that's manufactured for him by one place in the world. He's got a single source. It's not working in this one part in the world. He's sort of stuck. He's got to find a second source very quickly. Things like the second point here, complying with safety regulations in over 100 countries, that's a big issue, big hassle for Dow. You're having software that's going to be used in downtown Los Gatos, and that's about it. That won't be an issue. My point again with these examples is that the questions themselves, and it seems obvious in a way, it's important, the questions themselves change based on the context. Subtleties, I call these subtleties, that's a good word for it, it's things we don't know how to do very well. What I'd like to do is talk about some of the questions that come up when you're trying to do this. One is, how formal should it be? I've run some experiments on this, if you can call them that. And if anybody's interested without too much pain in participating, that would be welcome. I do this with a few firms. It doesn't require NDA generally. It doesn't require a non-disclosure agreement. The first question is, how much time is worth actually laboriously filling out sheets and computing numbers? And these experiments, what we do is we ask test professionals to give us their first off-the-cuff estimate or guesstimate in the situation. Intuitively, what do you think the major risks are and what's the ranking? Then we have them go through the paperwork. I would fill it over at risk assessment process. Might take hours or days, and then we come back and compare, see how much better, if any, the formalization has got the result. Is it worth doing all the paperwork of laboriously identifying things, writing it down, or is it worth instead just sort of brainstorming, just saying, let me think about this, let me look in the middle distance, say, I better check this, I better check that. And we found that the formalized approach helps a lot with people who are less knowledgeable about the situation. For people who are pretty knowledgeable about the experience in the particular environment, particular context, they tend to do it intuitively in their heads, and they don't really need the paper. So anybody have questions about this? There are some more important questions too. How well do we assess risks? This is definitely one of those places where you can use that famous tester's answer, it depends. How well do you need it to be done? Sometimes you get through just by apparently sheer dumb luck. But since I asked the question, I'll try to give you a sense of the typical practice out there. There's no such thing as average, of course, because everybody's different. But most people do some kind of risk assessment. How formal it is different. They'll go through and think about things and focus on parts of the system and document something on it, some kind of justification on it. It won't be elaborate. It won't have spreadsheets all over the place. It'll be crude but workable. The next thing I want to mention here is really a side point, but it's worth mentioning if you haven't thought about it before, incremental pruning. One way to do things, and when I describe this way to do things, it's going to sound ridiculous, but let me describe it anyway. One way to do things is to identify first all the test cases you might need. Then once you've got these all identified, you go and sort them through and sort down which ones are critical. That's, you're going to actually run the critical ones, the rest you probably won't run at all. Only problem with that approach is it takes a huge amount of effort to actually identify and define, document all those test cases. So what most people do is not that approach at all. They have an incremental pruning approach. They start out and say, okay, this part of the system, or this aspect of the system seems to be important. This one's not so important. We're going to put more test effort into that, but not less test into that. And they'll go into the effort they think is important, go into a bit more depth, and eventually get down to generating test cases in areas that are critical. But they're trying to sort of prune, they're trying to eliminate, if not eliminate, then give low probability, low credit to the areas they're probably not going to test in. They want to be able to dismiss them before they actually get the test cases designed. And it seems to work pretty well. Nothing but good old common sense, really. Anybody have questions?
So are you saying that each tester needs to understand the system? This is, what the customer's going to use in the full system versus, sometimes testing is broken up into pieces. And so, you only work on some small piece of the system.
Right. I think the question is more, the question was, does each tester need to understand the entire system? And I think the question, if I might rephrase it, or reframe it, so just to do justice to it, I think the question is more, not if they do need to know it or not. It's more like how well do they need to know it and in which areas. And I don't really have a good answer for that. I have Einstein's answer, which is famous. It's sort of slippery. You need to know just as much to do the job and no more. So what I can do is give you examples by anecdote. How much do we need to understand? It's enough to get the job done and no more. It doesn't seem very helpful, but I don't think every tester on a project has to know every last piece of functionality. Let's say, for example, there's a 6-month training class available for the user community. Does every single tester have to go through the 6-month training class, know the depth of how to do this transaction, how to do that one? Probably not. That's probably overkill. On the other hand, to give you an example of, I guess you'd call it underkill, I saw a test about 2 or 3 years ago now done at State Farm Insurance. Briefly, State Farm is a large organization. They're headquartered in a little town in Illinois, about 2 hours drive south of Chicago. And to get to the point here, they had a work group at that time, they probably still do, that did some kind of insurance claims processing. This work group, clerical people, would get a work unit in the door, get a package in the door, and they'd have to go through a series of steps to get the job done. This series of steps required a computer interaction. Each individual step was some kind of turnaround, some input with some kind of response from the computer. They had their business process re-engineered about 3 years ago. And before that, it took the clerks typically about 50 to 75 steps to go through one work unit. They do this, then do this, then do this. That's 50 to 75 steps. After re-engineering, which was designed to simplify and expedite the process, it came down from about 50 to 75 steps to more like maybe 20 to 30. To get to the point here, if you walked around the user area, the cubicles, it was just obvious at first glance that the users were very happy. They seemed to be motivated, they liked the new system, very productive and so on. Now the performance of this group, there's a reason I'm getting to this, the performance of this group was monitored by another group, a different group, who had never met the users and never seen what they did in terms of work and never been in their work area. The performance monitoring group was in a different building, and what happened was the following. The work unit was reduced from 50 to 75 steps down to more like 20 to 30. However, each individual step, each turnaround with the computer system took longer because there was much more data rich, there was much more data to retrieve and massage and so on. So the people monitoring the performance, not realizing these individual turnarounds, steps, were just part of the whole, looked at the individual components, and each individual turnaround response time was about 30-35% slower. The guys at the remote group concluded that, therefore, the system was in terrible shape. Productivity must have degraded by about 35%. In fact, the opposite was true. That's a nice example, but I'm not sure I can tell examples better than that. One thing I'd say here, and attempt to be helpful, in case you think I'm being facetious, one thing I find with these kinds of things is we need to do what I call feel for the edge. Day by day, you sort of ask yourself, do I know enough yet? In this particular, I'm a tester, I'm working on this particular aspect of the system. Do I know enough about it to feel confident I'm able to go ahead? If I'm not confident, assuming I have the luxury of choice, I'm not being pressured with the deadline, I'll say, let's put another day in, and then reevaluate day by day or even hour by hour. Do I know enough? Do I know enough? And sort of feel for the edge, and then you get to that point and say, okay, I'm there, we're done. That's nice and simple, but of course that doesn't allow for things like differences in user psychology, I should say tester psychology. Some testers would never let the thing go out the door. They say, after 300,000 years, I still haven't studied enough, this kind of thing. But that's the best answer that we can get. How long do they need? No, and often this is addressed in other ways too. Let's say we have, I was just talking to some people from Microsoft yesterday. They have a major new system to be tested, and the testers obviously don't know much about the functionality. It's an internal system for Microsoft itself. But they're planning to get some people from the user community in to work with them, so that will help a bit. It's way around the problem. So unfortunately, my answer is not very precise, but at least we know it's an issue. Did that help? Or I figure if I talk long enough, you'd forget the question. So, okay. Gee, our time is getting short. Didn't realize it was so late. Let me fast forward. The subjectivity question is very important. Let me give you a quick, I'll probably skip a few overheads here, but let me just give you a quick view of the subjectivity question. There's a big lot of controversy going on about certification of software test professionals. You might have heard about it. There's a big controversy going on about licensing, states licensing software test professionals. And some people believe that we can have exams like engineers have to say we are competent or not. Now, given that background, what's that got to do with us? Well, let's say you're putting together an exam question for a certification or licensing on this area of risk-based testing. You have an exercise. To get the right answer, how do you get that? One way to do it perhaps is to get a group of experts together, perceived experts, subject matter experts, and have them do it, and see if they have similar answers. If they answer all over the place, obviously you have a problem. So they have similar answers. Do you take the core of the commonality and say, this is the right answer, this is the answer we had. So some of the questions we need to address here is, if you're ever going to use this stuff for things like litigation, they did a good job in testing. No, they didn't do a good job in testing litigation potential like this. You need to have some kind of objectivity. Where do we get it from? What I'm doing is experimentation to see how closely different testers, based on the level of experience, come to the same answer or not. And I'm getting definitely, I've done it with about 250 testers now around figures. Definitely a mixed bag on this. Again, the group of experts, if they are socialized and have worked together quite a bit, they've been a team in the same environment, tend to have fairly similar answers. That might be misguided. They might be all sort of looking incorrectly together. Experienced test professionals with widely different backgrounds tend to come up with widely different answers to the same question about what's the answer to a risk assessment exercise. And the people who are newbies tend to, newcomers tend to come up with answers that are somewhat different too. The reason for the two questions first, one is the breadth between the difference of answers, divergence of answers amongst the experts. That gives an idea about whether the whole field is mature enough that you can even have sort of one answer, just instead of a scattering of different answers. And the second one, comparing the newbies to the experienced people, is there any actual learning involved? Are people doing this no better than they were 15 years ago when they first started in the software testing? So the answers on those questions definitely may be to both. They seem to be mixed. We don't really have conclusions yet. I hope you see the importance of the questions, right, about subjectivity. If you're in a lawsuit, you don't want somebody to say, this is the way you should have tested because this is the holy gospel on testing. You might be able to say, I used my judgment, and here's the defense of it. So we've already talked about this already, consensus among the experienced testers. I'm going to, as I said, move ahead a little bit. But the important point here, I said before, gains and losses are treated differently psychologically. Our friend at the back said this, the second point, lower and high probabilities warp the decision making. Bayesian methods, I'll just skip over this and for the time, and then get into this idea of prospect theory. These fellows developed this, and again, they got the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. Anybody have a chance to have a look at their work? Anybody read any summary of this? I think it may have implications for us, perhaps profound implications for us as software testers, because it's talking about how to get a better sense, a more realistic sense of what the probabilities are. You have a typical example at the bottom of the page here. People, when they drive across town, to say $5 on a $15 calculator, but not $5 on a $125 coat. We have lots not say about this kind of thing. In fact, about 900 years ago, when I was a graduate student at Stanford, I worked on this kind of stuff myself, not as a thinker. I was just sort of a hired hand. I was on some kind of research and teaching fellowship. And to earn my keep, I did the data processing, the coding, and data crunching for some psychology professors. That we have lots of what appear to be inconsistencies. They appear to be inconsistencies that violate our sense of order, how people think. Some more examples here. Rather than try to read them to you, I'll just give you a moment to browse through this and read it. I think the key word here is at the bottom of the page, asymmetry, asymmetric behavior. Unless anybody has any comments, I'll just move straight ahead. Another example, and I don't mean to drown you in examples. This is probably enough for the moment. In other words, what we're saying here is the way the choices are framed, or the way they're positioned, whatever word you want to call it, people will tend to make different choices for exactly the same situation. And this is including not just, people who don't read anything more than TV guides. This is including people like professors and students. So, given this behavior, this is prospect theory. The name prospect theory really doesn't mean too much, I don't think. I think the fellows, Kahneman and Tversky, chose a name they thought would sound good, It's to do with the prospects of something happening. Another example here, automobiles. And in terms of the misperceptions of probability, we tend to find the problems are worse when there's some kind of multiple combination of probabilities. This happens, then that happens. Event A depends on event B, or vice versa. So you have some kind of combination of probabilities. That's when it seems to get worse. Another example. I'm moving very quickly and a bit glibly through this, so let me just pause and leave this up for a few more seconds and just see if anybody's got any questions on it. We have probably hundreds of thousands of experiments like this showing these apparent inconsistencies of human behavior. It's good for us because it causes us to go look for a better model of how people think. There's two types of probability out there, so-called conjunction and disjunctive. And I always get them mixed up in my head, but I have them on the next page. Basically, they are combinations of events, and as I just said a moment ago, we find that when there are multiple probabilities involved, people's intuition as to what the right percentages are tend to be even more off. And they tend to be consistently off too, somewhat consistently off. Okay, disjunctive is what's the probability of event A or B happening? Conjunctive is probably of A and B. And the second one is successive. A or B might be two things happening in parallel, but A and B is typically in sequence. A, then B. If A happens, then B. So you typically say the first thing, probability of A happening or not happening, those two together, A happening or not happening, would add up to 100% probability. That if A happens, then that might have, let's say, 40% probability in itself that A does happen. Once A has happened, once the probability of B happening too, you have to multiply the two probabilities together to get that. So conjunction typically requires multiplication. Disjunctive typically requires addition. Now, one of them consistently underestimates, not consistently all the time, but another one consistently overestimates. And I haven't found a clear pattern yet that I've been able to put together, but the research I've been doing on this, if you can call it research, is the following. I've been working with various test teams saying, okay, let's look at your test risk assessment. Let's identify areas where there was obviously conjunction. Remember again, conjunction is where we have the word and where did you seem to overestimate? Let's look at conjunction where you seem to underestimate. We seem to put some patterns together. That's about the current state of what I know about it. What I'm seeking to do is the following. I want to develop some rules of thumb here, and they might be context specific. I don't know that I have a general list yet. Some rules of thumb to say when you're doing your risk assessment, you should adjust. You should adjust for the differences between what you think is going on and what is likely to be going on. So adjust for the underestimation and overestimation we've seen. And I've got to categorize like this: conjunctive situations, which again are multiplicative, disjunctive, which are additive, and by aspect of the system. That's about everything I wanted to cover in these notes. Let's just see if I have anything else in the overhead. Let me just see if you'd like to jump in and ask questions on this. Yes, sir.
Well, do you have practical suggestions for software testing based on this, or can you give suggestions of what bugs we might tend to underestimate or overestimate probabilities of?
Yeah, I don't know that I can give you. I don't know that I can give you. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Thanks. The question was, can I give? Tell me again.
Practical suggestions about software testing.
Right. The answer. The question was practical suggestions about software testing. I don't think I understand the situation well enough yet to have a generic answer, and there's probably no generic answer out there. I think what I can do, and I'll be very happy to do this, is either right now as an example, one-on-one or offline one-on-one, just go through your situation and say, I do this and I do that. Because I don't think I've reduced it to a formula yet. What I do know is the following. I've done a lot of this over the years, what I'm trying to do is the following. I'm trying to apply these ideas here back to what we already have. Talking about major risk factors here. There's one example. this is where we talked about range risk factors initially. I'm going through the same process as I always did, typically with test teams, and we're going through a risk identification, which means typically using checklists to say what are the risks in this situation. The number of risks are never ending, of course, which means infinite. So we just try to come up with a first cut of what we think are the significant risks, which are already to some degree prioritized. Once we have that first list of risks, and they might be categorized like this, customer impact, this feature is going to have a high customer impact, this feature is going to have a low customer impact. We then go through the traditional spreadsheet or worksheet approach, identify the risk factors, which are row titles, come up with some way of assessing the probability of them happening, the likelihood, and then come up with a way of assessing the consequences and sort of ranking them by this. The difference is that as we're doing this, what we're doing now is on the probability column especially, we're saying, okay, just we would have done this, let's see if there's anything in this theory about conjunctive and multiplicative and disjunctive and additive that we might actually apply. We know that we tend to underestimate in that kind of situation. This number here says is a moderate risk. It seems to apply. Let's tweak that up to a high risk. This kind of thing. This other area instead, so this is a fairly high risk, but we know that this is probably overestimated, so let's tweak it down. We're using this sort of a way of refining the perceived priorities for the ranking of the different things to test. Now, I'm talking very generally, but does that make sense as an approach? And as I said, if you like, I'd be very happy to go through a situation with you, sort of a project-by-project experience, but I don't think we've gotten to the point where we can say, okay, for this type of project, for the testing project, here's what we do. Maybe we'll get there in the future. Anybody else on this question? It's a good question. I just wish I had a better answer. Yes, sir?
So do you think testers are optimistic or pessimistic?
I think it's relative. I think there's some information out there that says the following. To indirectly answer first, there's a lot of information out there that says the software engineering community is fairly optimistic. And there's also some evidence that says that the test community perhaps is more optimistic than it should be. There's some work done by a couple of professors of psychology in the Midwest, and they've looked at the ratio of positive versus negative test cases. Is everybody here comfortable with the terms positive and negative? Anybody not? Everybody's comfortable with it, right? Okay. So one good question that I like to ask, not to put people on the spot, but one good question I like to ask testers is, what's the ratio of positive and negative test cases you have? Most testers, I find, don't really know that number off the top of their heads, but the findings of these professors, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but the findings of these professors is that the mix seems to be something like 70% positive or higher, maybe 80-90% positive and only 10-20% negative. Based on the history of the past, it probably should be a bit more the other way. In other words, we're too optimistic, we're not doing enough to break the system. If you look at most regression test case libraries, which is a bit unfair because those are already set up to rerun test cases we expect to pass, most regression test case libraries are very, very heavily weighted towards the positive test case, about 97-98% positive test case, only 1-2% negative. So I would say, based on this work, that testers are probably on the optimistic side, but certainly, even if we are optimistic, we're certainly a lot more realistic than software engineers and project managers and other people in general. At the risk of boring you silly and talking the point to death, let me just add a little bit more here. I saw what I thought was an interesting juxtaposition of numbers a few years ago. I was doing a lot of work in the late 1990s for Cisco as a consultant. Also doing a lot of work for Bell Labs as a consultant too. And Cisco down in San Jose have an automated regression test facility. I'm not sure how big it is these days, but back then it was several 100,000 test cases run automatically every night, run fast enough and cheap enough. They just did a full regression test. Now, in this regression test case library of Cisco, the mix of test cases was roughly about 98% positive, about 2% negative. At the same time, Lucent had some giant test labs in towns west of Chicago with names like Naperville and Indian Hill, and they had their own huge regression test case libraries. But the mix was quite different. In Bell Labs, the mix was more like 30% positive test cases, 70% negative, versus 98% to 2% for Cisco. Let me just touch on the reasons, because it's going to tie back to the risk-based testing we've been talking about. One reason was the age of the products. Back then, typically, the Cisco product was maybe 2 years old, maybe 1 year old, maybe 3 years old. It was very new. By contrast, the typical Lucent product was quite old, 15, 20, 30 years old. And over time, there's a tendency for every regression test case library for it to gradually turn more negative if you maintain it, which not everybody does if you maintain it, because there's a tendency to, fix problems, and if they're severe enough, you don't just fix the problems, you also generate or create new test cases to catch those kind of problems in the future. Those test cases get out to the regression test case library. So over time, the regression test case library tends to grow in volume and tends to slowly so negative, slowly more negative. That's not the primary reason for the difference. The primary reason was risk. It goes back to the underlying technology. Cisco has routers which are TCP, IP based, and they're basically highly decentralized, highly decoupled. Lucent, we're talking about their giant telephone switches, can handle millions of telephone calls simultaneously, some of the big ones. And these old telephone switches had a central architecture, which meant if one of the names of these beasts were, the big ones were called 5ESS, that was a brand name, 5ESS. So a telephone switch this size would take care of half the mid-peninsula area. There were central architectures, so if one of these switches went down, nobody could get dial tone at all. So because of the high risk of one going down and wiping out telephone service to millions of people, compared to the Cisco routers, if one router goes down, the message traffic that's routed through hundreds of thousands of other routers to the endpoint. Given that high risk, the negative to positive ratio of Lucent was, I think, justified. 30% positive test cases, 70% negative. I hope that was of interest.